Hello. We're going to go ahead and get started now. My name is Charles Pryzan, and I'm the chair of the Schlinger Ethics Symposium committee this year. And I am so happy to have everybody here, and I think you're all in for a big treat. I've been working with a wonderful committee of very committed people who have put a lot of thought and effort into bringing together what we feel will be at least a very thought-provoking and eye-opening discussion, and what we hope will be an evening that might reinforce some of your feelings on gun violence prevention in our society, but could also challenge some of your assumptions on the topic. I'd like for the committee members to stand up now and be recognized for all of your efforts. Thank you very, very much. The topic for tonight's symposium is one that cuts to the very core of what many of us feels it means to be an American. No matter on which side of the topic your feelings currently fall, our committee has endeavored to provide you with a wonderful group of panelists that will present a fair and balanced view of how an individual's right to gun use and ownership can conflict with or mesh with society's role in providing a safe and protective environment for us all. So I'd like to turn this over to Rabbi Stern now, who'll give us some history of the Schlinger Ethics Symposium and introduce our panelists and be the moderator for tonight's symposium. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Charles. Thanks to all of you thank you to Charles, thank you to the wonderful committee, thank you to Becky Slackman, who is conscientiously roving the room for all of her hard work as a staff person, so thank you, Becky. I won't engage in too much of a history of the symposium, but I do want to say a little bit about the man by whose name it is honored. Henry Schlinger was a person who embodied the remarkable combination of dispassionate analysis, powerful ethical compass, and commitment to community, all with not only a sense of humor, but a deep sense of humanity, and his name honors this symposium. Tonight's symposium is given honor by Henry's name and substance and illumination by the names and gathered wisdom of our four panelists. We're grateful to Andrea Brower, to W. Scott Lewis, to Reverend Edwin Robinson, and to Professor Robert L. Young for sharing their time and expertise to clarify and challenge our thinking. I invite you to read their bios in the program, but only when the moderator is talking. I want to start by clarifying what is at issue tonight and what is not. What is not at issue is that gun violence is a scourge that afflicts our nation. What were once just names of cities, Charleston, Newtown, Orlando, Aurora, Tucson, Columbine, Dallas, or the campus of Virginia Tech, now represent an American geography of tragic loss. What is not at issue is that those cities and the mass shootings represent only a small percentage of the lives lost to gun violence each year, victims whose names and hometowns never even rise to our attention. What is not at issue is that Scripture actually doesn't mention guns, but it does decry senseless violence. It does hold human life in the world sacred, and it does make clear that any society that allows human life to become cheapened will suffer physically and spiritually. What is not at issue is that every American has an obligation to act to reduce the risk and the reality of the murders, the suicides, the accidental deaths, the loss of children and adults that result from gun violence. What is at issue is what in the world, or in the legislature, or in our homes, or in our schools, to do about it. And thus tonight's symposium. How do we address this scourge? How do we safeguard both the freedom of individuals and the well-being of a community? What is the relationship between individual rights and communal responsibility, not just abstractly, but on this particular issue? What is the relationship between individual rights and individual responsibilities? How can we live both safely and freely? And what are the reasonable accommodations that will allow us to do so? These are questions of philosophy and faith, of legislative advocacy and social behaviors. That's why we're so privileged to learn from exactly the people on this panel this night. But first, a preview of procedure. In a moment, I'm going to turn the program over to our panelists for their opening statements in alphabetical order, which is the same order they appear in your program. I will then respond to their statements with some questions. You received on your way in index cards and pencils, which give you an opportunity to ask your questions. We'll do our first round of collecting index cards after all four panelists have given their presentations and during the question and answer that's taking place up here, which may also include some questions that they choose to ask each other. And then we'll start collecting your cards, and I'll look through them and I'll try to figure out where the clusters of interest and concern are, and I'll ask questions that hopefully do justice to the questions you've submitted up front here. So that's why we're here. We're grateful to you for being here. As many of you know, we at Temple Emanu-El see as part of our role in the community not only an historic legacy of social justice, but also a much-needed role in the present, which is to be a forum for open-minded, open-hearted discussion of difficult issues. It's our conviction that in too many places in today's society, with the rampant polarization that we all suffer from and in ways that we know and don't contribute to, that there are too few places where people of differing opinions can come together, learn from one another, and illuminate the issues of our time. We hope as a congregation in this city to be such a place. This symposium has historically been such an opportunity, and we believe that such opportunities are more important now than ever, so we thank you for making it possible, and we thank you for being here. We're going to begin with Andrea Brower.
Thank you very much for having me here this evening. I'm delighted to be here with everybody. My name is Andrea Brower. I'm the Executive Director of Texas Gun Sense. I have the remarkably easy job of trying to reduce gun violence in the state of Texas. We are a very small nonprofit in Austin, and we do a lot of public policy work there. We started in 2013 after the Sandy Hook shooting. That's when a lot of state gun violence prevention groups started. I'm sure y'all have heard of Moms Demand Action, and I see you back here. That's where when they started as well. And they've got a lot of members and a grassroots organization and are very strong. We are a much smaller organization, and as I said, we largely focus on public policy. So I work full-time in Austin, and I work during the interim to work with state agencies and other organizations to come up with some policy solutions to gun violence. And I work with legislators during the interim, and I'll talk a little bit about the legislative session in a couple of minutes. We also do some communications work and writing. Our job is also to raise awareness on the issue. And we try to bring people together to find common ground. We all know this is a polarizing issue. Unfortunately, people are usually pushed into two camps. You're either anti-gun or you're pro-gun, and there's no in between. We started the Coalition to Reduce Gun Violence in 2015. We bring people to the Capitol every 3 months and have a conversation. We have it there so that Republicans and Democrats can come in. Our first step, define the problem. Do we have a problem? We just declared today, yes, we have a problem. All right, if we can admit that, and all come together, okay, what are we going to do about the problem? What can we do as a state to move forward while still respecting gun rights, because that's an important right for Texans, respecting the Second Amendment, but also trying to keep people safer. And there's a lot of people, you know, despite those two camps, there's a lot of people that are in the middle. They're just not speaking up. So we try really hard as an organization to actually work with the gun owners. I walk the halls with firearm trainers, with a gun shop owner, gun violence survivors, and with law enforcement, because I want to see people other than me, a mom of 2 children and white middle-aged person, you know, caring about this issue, showing that we can unify and we can address this issue. So, and then I think we're making some progress. So why do we work on this issue? 567 kids were killed or injured in 2014 alone. 2,000 suicides last year by firearms alone. Suicides were a lot higher in Texas, but 2,000 from firearms, it was a big jump, and 63% of all the gun deaths in Texas are suicides. So there are 3,200 gun deaths a year. It was a big jump. To give you a comparison, 3,900 people die due to motor vehicle accidents every year. 3,200 people die due to guns every year. What do we do to prevent motor vehicle accidents? Click it or ticket, drive safe and sober, X the text, turn around, don't drown. Has anyone ever seen a campaign about store your gun securely from the state of Texas? Nothing. So we spend $64 million a year to try to prevent auto accidents, and we spend nothing to try to prevent the gun deaths. We're making that an issue at the Capitol. We worked with legislators to get two bills filed. We're working in appropriations and Senate finance to try to direct some money toward these campaigns. Who could disagree with it, right? Public education, it doesn't infringe on rights. Well, unfortunately, some people in the gun lobby are disagreeing with us, so we're having to fight that too. As I said, we try to bring people together. I actually reach out to the gun lobby and I try to have conversations with them. I've sat down with a couple, I've debated, I've gone on gun talk shows. Unfortunately, the NRA and the Rifle Association will not talk to me. So, and when I tell legislators that, they're not happy about it. I've worked around the Capitol since 1999, and I've never had an organization refuse to sit down and even have the conversation. Okay, but back to the bad news for a few more minutes. Another thing that we work on is gun trafficking and crime, trying to reduce crimes. 18,000 guns were lost or stolen in 1 year in Texas. That's a lot of criminals with guns in their hands. So when we talk safe storage, it's not just about kids and preventing suicides, it's about reducing crime also. We all know about background checks. We don't have universal background checks in Texas, and up to 20% of guns are sold without a background check in Texas. So to sum all that up, Texas gets an F grade from the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence on our gun laws. So I've been researching ways that we can move forward and address, I met with the governor's office and he said, I'm against gun control, but what I will look at is mental health and criminal justice. So I said, all right, well, let's take a look at it. So we crafted our agenda to do sort of two things, and I have some information on the table out there. I have our legislative agenda and a brochure about what we do, and a sign-up sheet if you're interested in getting some more information and alerts about the good and the bad bills that are coming down the pike this session. But our legislative agenda this session, we're working on suicide prevention and safe storage and accident prevention. And then we also have some enforcement bills. How many people have heard, we don't need more laws on the books, we need to enforce the ones we have. Well, through my research, I've found, well, we really don't have the state laws in place to adequately enforce the laws on the book. I mean, we have 40% of crime guns going to Mexico, or come from Texas. I could go on and on about these things. I should probably try to stay within my 5 minutes, but I do hope that you'll take a look at our agenda. There are some bills that we think are going to endanger public safety this session. Unlicensed carry, or what they call constitutional carry. Anyone can carry a gun anytime without a license, without training, many times without a background check. We don't think this will pass this session, but it's passed in several states so far. There's a lot of bills to expand where guns can be carried on school grounds and polling places and stadiums and bars, and reducing the training and the requirements in order to be able to have a license to carry. There is a bill, a physician's gag order, that says you cannot ask about the presence of guns in the home if you're a physician. I don't think that bill is going to go anywhere, but it's been filed. So all of you are here because you care about the issue. I'll close my opening remarks just by saying, like I said, I hope that you will speak up. More legislators need to hear that you care about the issue. And as I say, gun rights are important, and I know you're going to hear from Scott about that, and I understand and appreciate it, but it's unbalanced. There's so much discussion on gun rights and just not enough on public safety. So they need to hear, I don't want our gun laws weakened. I want our gun laws strengthened, and I want a focus on reducing gun violence in the state of Texas. It's important to me, and it's a public health issue. So thank you.
Thank you. Scott, please.
My name is Scott Lewis. I'm a longtime Texas gun rights activist. I was a founding board member of Students for Concealed Carry on Campus. I also consult with the group NFA Freedom Alliance and with a group called Knife Rights, which is kind of like the NRA for knives. I can trace my interest in gun rights to the fall of '91.
I was a little shy of my 12th birthday when I saw in the news a story about a shooting at a Luby's cafeteria in Killeen. This was at the time the worst mass shooting in U.S. history. One of the survivors of that shooting was a woman by the name of Susanna Gracia Hupp. She watched both of her parents die that day. When she came out of that shooting, she said that when the shooting started, they dove under the table and she reached into her purse for a gun that wasn't there. The reason that gun wasn't there was because at the time, there was no legal way to carry a handgun in the state of Texas unless you were a law enforcement officer. She had been carrying one for years illegally, as a lot of Texans did at that time, but she started worrying that if she was arrested for carrying one, she might lose her chiropractic license. So she decided, well, I'm just going to start leaving it in the car because that was a little more of a gray area as far as the law was concerned, and she thought if I need it, I'll probably be stranded on the side of the road or something anyways. So she was down under the table. The gunman had his back to her. She was looking up at him, so there wasn't much worry of a crossfire. She reached in there. The gun wasn't there. She watched both of her parents die. That stuck with me. The idea that something as simple as having that gun or not having it might have made a difference. And I will never say that concealed carry would have made a difference in a specific shooting. There's too many variables to know that. What we do know is that it would very likely change the odds. Now, the next moment that resonated with me was the spring of 2007. I was sitting at my desk working. I had the TV on next to the desk, muted as I usually did, tuned to CNN, just so I could kind of keep an eye on what was happening in the world. And there was a breaking news alert from Blacksburg, Virginia. There'd been another mass shooting. This, again, was the worst mass shooting in U.S. history. And as we heard more and more details about this, we heard stories about a young woman who was on the phone with 911 for 5 minutes before she was shot. We heard about a Holocaust survivor who died barricading the door with his body so that his students could escape through the window. There were people who had the time and the inclination to respond to that shooting, to react, to try to save themselves, to try to help the people around them, but they were forced to respond with the tools available to them at that time, and one of the tools that was not available was a handgun. Now, I've been a concealed handgun license holder since 2003. I carry regularly throughout my day-to-day routine. And just the week before the Virginia Tech massacre, I had accompanied my girlfriend at that time, who was a theater major at Texas State University. I had accompanied her to a student play at Texas State. And I remember very specifically locking my gun in the vault in my car before we went into the theater and thinking how silly it was that state law would allow me to carry that concealed handgun to a movie theater there in town. It would allow me to carry it to the community theater there in town. But if I carried it into that student theater, I became a felon. And so at the time, it was just a passing thought. I'm walking across the parking lot thinking how silly it was that I had to lock up that gun before I could go into the theater there. But a week later, when I'm sitting there watching the body count continue to rise from Blacksburg, Virginia, I thought back to that incident. I thought, what if that shooting had happened in that theater? What would I have done? Would my last thought before dying have been about that handgun locked 100 yards away in my car? You know, might I have survived to have to tell my girlfriend's mother how she died that day? I imagined a lot of scenarios, and I didn't like any of them as much as the scenario where I at least had a chance to fight back. So that day, I started writing a blog post, and it turned into an op-ed, and started writing about the issue of why are we taking college campuses, which are open environments. A college campus, pragmatically speaking, you can walk into a classroom carrying a backpack full of guns just as easily as you can walk in there carrying a backpack full of books. So my question was, why are we creating this arbitrary honor system-based policy that basically stacks the odds in favor of anybody willing to disregard state law and school policy? I wrote about this for several weeks. I couldn't get anybody to pick up any of the op-eds or anything because at that time I didn't have an organization that I was affiliated with that would kind of give me standing to publish an op-ed. A couple months go by, a friend of mine says, you need to get on Facebook. It's this new thing on the internet, check it out. I get on there and immediately I'm drawn to all these political groups on there because I'm a political junkie. And so I start kind of sifting through these, seeing what's interesting, and I find some of the gun rights groups, and there's one somebody has started called Students for Concealed Carry on Campus. And I checked out this group, and this was, I guess, by now early August, and I was a little disappointed to see nobody had updated the Facebook page or the website since June, but it was a neat idea. And I saw that there were 3 people who were members of this Facebook group who were trying to put together a protest. They wanted to encourage college students to wear empty holsters on campus to demonstrate that students are left defenseless on campus. And they asked, does anybody know how to write a press release? We want to get some attention to this. And I've done freelance writing for most of my adult life, so yeah, I can write a press release. So I wrote the press release for them, and then I sat down and I wrote out kind of a frequently asked questions page of common arguments against this and kind of rebutting those arguments. And after we did this, I said, well, we need to track down the guy who started this page and see if he'll post them. He just disappeared. It took me about a week to track him down. I finally tracked him down, and he said, look, I started this, the day after the Virginia Tech massacre just because, I felt compelled to, but he said, I didn't realize this was going to kind of get the attention it has. I don't have time to run it. So he handed over the entire organization to me, and I and these 3 other guys who were trying to put together this protest, we became the first board of directors for Students for Concealed Carry. Now, my philosophy on gun laws, or in politics in general, is that laws need to be based on empirical research. They need to be fact-based, and they need to accomplish what they're set out to accomplish, and if they're not accomplishing that, we have to rethink them. And this is, my overarching position when we start talking about gun control is what does it really accomplish? Because there are absolutely things we can accomplish, but there are a whole lot of measures that people propose, that people push, that have been proven ineffective, or that from a strictly fact-based standpoint are incapable of accomplishing what people want to accomplish. So, when I first got involved with gun rights, I was considered a little bit of, at least in the political arena, not among the gun rights community, but in the political arena, I was considered a little bit of a gun rights hardliner. The idea of, allowing concealed carry on college campuses was considered the fringe. Now I'm very much a gun rights moderate because the paradigm has shifted. The discussion has moved so far to the right that it's leaving a lot of us behind, which is unfortunate. So I still very much think of myself as a gun rights advocate and activist. That's what I'm here to represent today, but I will also tell you up front, we're probably going to discuss some gun rights positions that even I take a step back from and say, I'm not okay with that. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I hope I can answer your questions and kind of give you a little better perspective on the gun rights position.
Great, thank you, Scott. Reverend.
Hello, everyone. So good. It's always good to be in Temple Emanu-El. This is one of my favorite places in the city, and I see a lot of good friends out there. I see your faces, so it's good to see you. So I'm going to have a conversation about race, and I know we came to have a conversation about guns, but the reality is that you can't have a conversation about guns unless we have a conversation about race. And why is that the case? After the July 7th attack on our police officers here in our city, our police officers were scrambling to try to protect themselves and the community. And in the midst of them scrambling to protect themselves and the community, they got an anonymous tip that the live shooter was in the crowd. It happened to be a gentleman who was carrying a rifle slung to his back, a black man, and this gentleman was accused of being the shooter. And the press immediately went out and said, this is the shooter, they got him. And then for him to be consistently harassed over and over again because he was not the shooter, as we came to find out. And his family and his home, they were protested outside. I raised a conversation around race also because I spoke with a number of officers a few months later. And these officers were telling me that because of the new policy around being able to carry concealed carry in Dallas, that when they make a traffic stop, they automatically assume that everyone they stop is carrying. Why does this present a problem as it relates to race? Well, because the reality is, when I am stopped by a police officer, whether that police officer is doing their job or not, there's an inherent fear that is raised up in me because I'm a black man in America. And the reality is that being a black man in America, whether the officer is a good officer or a bad officer, it makes me a target. And now if I'm already a target by the color of my skin, if you add on to that that officer may assume that I'm carrying a weapon, that means that any movement that I make that may be a regular movement to get my insurance card, to pull out my driver's license, could be the end of my life, i.e. Philando Castile. This is one of the reasons why race has to be a part of this conversation. I've talked to police officers and they said one of the laws that they hate the most is the fact that people can carry concealed weapons inside the city limits, period. They said it does not make their job easier, it makes their jobs harder. They say it does not allow them to hold up public safety in any way. It said their anxiety is raised up along with the community's anxiety. And if you happen to not be one of those people who are carrying, then you are left defenseless. So we have this problem, right, that is not simply about should we have stricter laws or weaker laws? Should people be able to carry guns or not be able to carry guns? At the end of the day, the problem is about how do we create policies and how do we live a life where we don't have to be afraid of each other? I don't want to be afraid of police officers. I also don't want to be afraid of my neighbors. One of the things that actually scares the heck out of me is if that gentleman who on July 7th had his gun slung to his back and someone who was carrying a weapon thought that he was the shooter and they thought their responsibility was to protect and they pulled out that weapon and shot him, then we would have had another death on our hands. I understand the mass shootings that we have all over. However, a lot of the violence that's happening is happening in our communities. I'm absolutely for moving policy, but I also feel like there is a lack of funding that's going into proven work that's happening in our communities around ceasefire. Simple work to just stop people from dying every day. Changing the gun laws, I'm not going to say they won't help the people who I love and know the most, because they will, they can. But I would say fundamentally changing our culture, right, around guns, period, is what's going to help us move forward. And to do that, there has to be a deep conversation around race, a deep conversation around how we understand the human value and human life. And so those are some of the things that I just want to inject into the conversation. I'm going to keep my opening remarks short and sweet. And I'll say this. As a community organizer, at the end of the day, I always have to say this. I fundamentally believe in the power of the people. And I say that to say that all of your faces here tonight and all of you in this room tonight, my hope is that you don't just represent yourself, but you represent your families, you represent your congregations, you represent your neighborhoods, you represent scores of people who you will not leave this room and keep this information to yourself, but you will go out and share whatever information you receive tonight, that you will have conversations that transcend this space, and that you will push people to see that at the end of the day, human value is more important than my personal right to life. And that's really what I fundamentally believe in.
Professor Young.
Well, First, I'd like to say you should never volunteer to follow a reverend in speaking. I agree with Scott that public policy should be should be founded on well-grounded and thoroughly done research. And I'm one of those people who does that kind of research. I started studying gun ownership primarily about 35 years ago when I was pondering possible topics for my dissertation at the University of Michigan, where I was a student in social psychology in the sociology department there. The dissertation led me to a publication which led me to other publications, and it occupied my academic life for the first 15 years or so. It morphed from an interest in guns and studying guns to an interest in study of attitudes toward the death penalty. What I want to, and I have some personal experience with guns. I grew up in the gun-loving state of Alabama with relatives who hunted and owned multiple guns, my father included. I became a hunter at probably about the age of 15 or so. I guess it was when I was in about my sophomore year in college that I lost interest in guns and ended up selling my shotgun to trading my shotgun to my brother for a portable television set that he had won in a yo-yo contest. I had later experience with guns. The night I was about to marry my wife, to whom I'm married now, about 20 years ago. The night before we would get married, as I was coming home from a little reception that had been given for us, I was held up at gunpoint in my driveway. And I remember at the point thinking the thing that I was most afraid of is that the guy holding the gun on me was going to shoot me by accident. About a year later, I was in a restaurant with some friends over in Fort Worth. The restaurant had just closed. We knew the people who owned the place. And the group of us were standing around talking, and 4 guys came in with sawed-off shotguns and pistols and held us up there. And I remember at that point, very foolishly, thinking, oh gosh, I'm going to have to get all my credit cards redone again, and and I literally, as the guy was, they had us lying on our faces. The guy was holding the gun at the back of my head, trying to get my wedding ring off, and I remember crooking my finger to keep him from getting it off, and this really irritated him, and he didn't get it. He got everything else, but I thought later, was I a total idiot for doing that? The only time I was shot at was actually when I was a teenager. And I went with a friend of mine to his uncle's house. His uncle lived out sort of out of town a ways, and we had started a little rock band, and we needed a trailer to put our equipment in for one of our first gigs, and his uncle had one he was going to loan us. Well, we, I guess, showed up a little later than the uncle was expecting, and before we got to the front door, he opened fire on us. We ducked behind some equipment he had in his yard, and fortunately nobody got hurt. So I really didn't think a whole lot about guns for a long time, but when I decided to, on my dissertation topic, I started the research. And I don't know if I have time to do it right now, but I'd like to share with you about a half dozen or so of the major findings of that research. And I'll try to do it quickly, and maybe if people have questions, I can elaborate on some of it more later. And this is based on research done on a national sample of American adults that is done by it's called the General Social Survey. It's the most comprehensive and well-conducted data source for social scientists and of survey research. And so let me just share with you some of the things that I discovered in trying to figure out, basically address the question of what is the difference between people who own guns or choose to own guns and people who don't? You know, what are some of the fundamental differences there? What I found first was that gun owners tend to report lower levels of fear of crime than non-owners. And this obviously could be because the guns make them feel safer. That certainly makes sense. It seems reasonable. But it could also be because those people who happen to own guns also happen to be less vulnerable to successful criminalization than those who don't. As it turns out, that is the case. For example, men are more likely to own guns than women. White people are more likely to own guns than African Americans. So what I realized was, or one way to think about this is in terms of a person's vulnerability to criminal victimization. A person can be vulnerable in two ways. One way is physical vulnerability, okay? Women are more vulnerable to attack than men because men are bigger, stronger, faster physically. Older people are more vulnerable than younger people because of the same reason, physical vulnerability. But there's a social vulnerability that a lot of people live with, especially those who are poor, who are ethnic minorities, who live in dangerous parts of cities, who have jobs that take them into areas where crime is high. And so that social vulnerability also is true of a group of people who are less likely to own crimes than those who do, or own guns than those who do. So it's a tragic irony that the people who need guns for protection are the groups that are less likely to have them. Another thing I discovered is that those who do not own guns are more likely than gun owners to use other forms of protection rather than buying guns to protect themselves. They're more likely to buy extra locks for their doors and windows, to buy extra lighting for the outside of the house, to get dogs, watchdogs, and to get alarm systems for their home. And the research shows consistently that people who are most vulnerable do those sorts of things. They don't buy guns for protection. Those who do not own guns are also more likely than gun owners to report that they have altered their behaviors in some way to avoid victimization. They try to avoid traveling through certain parts of a city, for example. They don't walk alone at night. They don't take public transit unless they have to, and so forth. In other words, they alter their behaviors to avoid being confronted by a criminal or having to confront a criminal who might victimize them. These things lead to one possibility that there is considerable, I think, support for. The idea is that those who are most vulnerable to crime make an effort to put a barrier between themselves. All of these behaviors represent putting a barrier between oneself and the would-be criminal. Gun owners are less likely to do those things. Why? Well, for a variety of reasons. I would argue that gun owners, white gun owners in particular, are more likely, and let me just add a few things here and then I'll give you the summary of this. White gun owners are more likely than white non-gun owners profess negative attitudes toward African Americans. They are more likely to believe that police do not provide sufficient protection from crime. And they're more likely than white non-gun owners to support a variety of strong measures against law violators, including stiffer sentences for criminals and stronger support for the death penalty. What this suggests to me is that in many cases, not all by any means, I would never say that, although I've been kind of indirectly accused of that at times, but in many cases, gun ownership is not motivated by fear, it's motivated by anger about crime. And that anger is associated with resentment toward anyone that they perceive to be inclined to criminality And to the extent that one is racially biased toward African Americans or Mexican Americans or any other group, that person is more likely to think, when they think about criminals and they think about who might victimize them, that's who they're thinking about. And that with that comes a desire to not protect yourself so much as to punish those who would try to victimize you. That to me is a sobering possibility, because that means that although the great majority of gun owners are people who have them for a variety of reasons, hunting, collecting, they were given to them by a relative, they see them as forms of protection if needed. And I think they have every right to own those guns, but it's kind of scary to me to realize that there is a segment of people who own guns largely because they are motivated by anger about crime, which is directed towards certain groups in a biased way, and are, in a sense, preparing themselves and even in some cases looking forward to that moment when they can use that gun to protect themselves. And I'll elaborate on that more if we have time. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm now going to toss some questions back to our panelists. This is the first opportunity for committee members to collect your cards. If you have them, just hold them up and the committee members will come get them. But we're going to, in the meantime, keep going up here. Scott, I'll start with you. Would you, you alluded to a paradigm shift that has left the hardliner in the center. Will you say a little bit about that implies that there's a certain diversity to the constituency that we would call gun rights activists or the gun lobby, whatever we might call it. Could you describe that diversity to us a little bit?
So the vast majority of gun owners, the vast majority of people who support gun rights, you never hear from. The people you do hear from are a small vocal minority. And that's the way it is in most political issues. This isn't specific to gun rights. But you do have to understand that when you see a group of people standing on a street corner with their rifles slung over their shoulders and holding protest signs or holding up, you know, the world's largest come and take it flag, they're not speaking for the vast majority of us, but they do represent the segment that is most heard. If that, you know, most heard at the Capitol, most heard on the television, the group we most often hear from is that vocal minority. Now, the gun rights community has, over the last, let's say, 25 years, been going through, I mean, it's been going through a shift for the last 40 years, but it's been going through a very specific shift for the last 25 years in the sense that 25 years ago, this fringe element who, among gun lobbyists, was often referred to as the camouflage people because they would wear camouflage in their daily lives for some reason. They were kind of, you know, you smiled at them and you nodded and you moved on. You know, I can remember being at a political party platform committee meeting back in 2000. And there was one guy who showed up for this meeting, and he started talking about, we've got to remove every gun restriction on the books. We've got to let people buy machine guns. There shouldn't be any background checks. And everybody in the room just kind of laughed and said, okay, buddy, thanks a lot. And we've gotten to the point where that guy would not be laughed at anymore. And the reason is, and this gets very complicated. I mean, well, I don't want to say it gets very inside baseball, but basically, at some point, the gun lobby figured out that small fringe element was the most likely to donate. There's a misconception that, for instance, the NRA makes most of its money from gun sales or gun manufacturers. The largest segment of their income comes from these individual fundraising campaigns where they send all of their members, you know, it used to be letters, I'm sure a lot of it's email now, and it says, such and such is the greatest threat to your gun rights in the history of America, and if you don't donate now, we're not going to be able to fight this. And so they figured out that there's this very small segment who every time that happens, they open up their checkbooks, and because of that, they've started pandering more to that group, so that now the people used to, you would encounter them at the gun show selling T-shirts or something, and you would just kind of smile and nod and move on. Now the inmates are running the asylum, so to speak. And so certainly there are a lot of us out there like me. I would say the majority of the gun rights advocates in Texas and in the country are like me, but we're not the ones who are being heard because, you know, the moderates aren't taking off work on a Wednesday to stand out on a street corner with their rifle and their sign. You know, they care about this, but they're not, you know, nobody stands outside a state house or a courthouse with a sign that says reasonable compromise. Okay?
We need that person.
The people who are worked up about this are the extremists. And it's troubling in the sense, not just because it's created this shift, but because it has moved us away from what was previously a very policy-driven discussion, which is now a much more ideology-driven discussion. And I guess I can probably leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Andrea, could you, in terms of your advocacy work on the state level, reflect with us a little bit on the DC v. Heller case and then the case, I guess, the subsequent year that made that applicable to the states, how that has changed the kind of work you need to do and how it's changed the kind of parameters for the arguments you want to make.
Yeah, that case talked about that people had the right to handguns for personal protection. The Second Amendment says that the militia, you know, the arming of the militia, well, the decision did say that individuals do have a right to carry guns and use it for self-protection. The Heller decision also said that it is a right, but states also have the duty to regulate and to pass reasonable regulations for the public safety of its citizens. So, and that has been reaffirmed time and time again in court cases. So when you get the fringe, like Scott talks about, saying, you know, constitutional carry, there's nothing constitutional about it. The Constitution does not say you can carry a gun, whoever you are, domestic abuser, felon, you can carry it anywhere, in the school, in any business, with no oversight whatsoever. We talk about the Heller Amendment a lot, and I mean Heller Agreement, I'm sorry, a lot, and that, you know, this is reasonable regulation, that we you know, have grounding. It's not overreach by any sense. So, so yeah, it is supported, and that's what we're trying to get the state to recognize and understand here, although it's tough in Texas, as Scott says.
And when you meet resistance on working for example, universal background checks or extending background checks to gun shows, online orders, things like that, what's the substance of the resistance?
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, first of all, a lot of people don't even know what a universal background check is. So in Texas, we have 7,400 licensed gun dealers, and those gun dealers are required by law to perform a background check. We also have private sellers. The problem is the private seller is not clearly defined. So there's a private seller that sets up a booth in a gun show, a private seller that sells over the internet, that sells out of the back of their truck, and they don't have to do background checks. And I kind of liken this to, you know, when we license people to practice dentistry in the state of Texas, we don't say, well, you need a license if you're practicing every day, but if you only do it once a weekend, you don't need a license. Go ahead and practice. No, I mean, it's the act of selling the gun and who's receiving it. It shouldn't matter, you know, whether you have a brick and mortar store or whatever. It's, you know, if we're saying that the act of selling the gun, it should accompany a background check. Now, I did my research on this, and I met with the ATF, and he said, you know, gun shows are a big problem, but a bigger problem is internet sales. Go on TexasGunTrader.com, 6,000 guns for sale on the internet. The Dallas shooting, that guy bought the gun on Facebook. So, I mean, these things are a big problem, and the pushback that you get, and of course the NRA is never going to support background checks or universal background checks. We did get a bill filed this time by Representative Blanco to close the gap on the internet sales. I mean, the law says that you need, if you sell a gun from El Paso, from Las Cruces, New Mexico to Houston, you have to have a ship to a dealer and have a background check. If you sell a gun from El Paso to Houston, no background check required if you're not a federally licensed dealer. That's inconsistent, and that regulation doesn't make sense. Now, the people in the State House and the people that push back and the gun rights groups say, well, those are private sellers. They shouldn't have to do it. And what if I just wanted to sell to my next door neighbor? And I always say, you know, what if your next door neighbor was Adam Lanza, the shooter in Newtown? Do you really know his background? Do you want to feel good that you sold that gun to that person? I mean, background checks usually take 15 minutes. They're called an instant criminal background check. You know, it's not a burden. Dealers can even charge a fee. I mean, so we're talking to DPS in the state. Can you just encourage people to do their deal there? Why do they have to do it at McDonald's? Why can't we do it? We do it there. And I'm getting on my soapbox and off the top of the question, Rabbi. I'm sorry about that. But that's the resistance. You know, we don't want. And you've heard. I mean, you've probably heard on TV the politicians saying, "When I did." Who heard Mike Huckabee say, "When I want something, I want it now." So I believe waiting periods for guns are just a waste of time because it just. You know, it keeps me from getting what I want. And so people don't want to be inconvenienced. They think they have an unrestricted right to get what they want when they want it, and they don't want to have any sensible oversight. So that's the pushback. I mean, I know, Scott, you mentioned unproven policies. Background checks work. I mean, they've stopped millions of gun sales over the years since the Brady Law took effect. And studies have shown that the states that have them have, 48% fewer law enforcement officers killed, domestic abusers, domestic violence incidents and deaths. So, yeah.
Scott, I'm going to come back to you on that in a minute. There's a remarkable number of questions to begin with. Scott, comma. But we'll come back to you in a moment. Reverend Robinson, you said that policy is nice, but cultural change is more important. Can you help us? Can you think aloud with us about how to begin or put a dent in this process of cultural change?
Sure. So the reality, as I even listened to the conversation that's even being had, the reality is we can have universal background checks, but that's not going to stop people who look like me from dying at the hands of guns. We can not have universal background checks, and again, it's not going to stop people who look like me from being killed by guns. One of the fundamental issues, and if you know, I was in the United States Army. I've been to Iraq twice, so I've shot my fair share of guns, weapons as we would call them. The reason why we call them weapons in the military and not guns, because the point of them is to kill people. I mean, the point of a gun is to kill people. We can shape it. We can do cute rhetoric around it in any way we want. But when they handed me my weapon in the United States Army, we weren't allowed to call it a gun. We called it a weapon, right? And so the very reality, right, and to the research that Professor Young gave, his research, while I sincerely appreciate it, unfortunately it frustrates me, right, that I have to give research for the lived experiences of the people who I know. Like, I can't just simply tell the story, right, of black and brown people who are fundamentally targeted, right, by white people, majority, culture, society, and let that be enough, right? I have to give all of the research to prove it. The reality that we have to fundamentally, right, having the conversation about should I carry a gun or not is such a frustrating conversation for me, because it's a conversation that's being had above the heads of the people who are being impacted daily. And so we're having this conversation about should I be able to carry, should I be able to make you wait to carry, when no one is asking, right, the families who are the victims of gun violence, do you think guns are helpful or harmful in the first place, right? Like these sorts of questions I feel that get at the heart of human dignity should really raise to the top of this conversation. Not my ability to protect my family from someone with a gun, right? But my ability to not have to worry about someone with a gun. And then that is heightened the further down you get on the societal hierarchy, right? So having said that, it's a lot to think about, right, Rabbi Stern? It is a lot to deal with. It is you're right. There's a sincere right culture of being able to carry guns in Texas and in the South and all these places, right? And there's a sincere culture of being able to go out and shoot for sport, and it's cool. I can dig it. But when I go to I don't own a bowling ball, right? Because I'm not a professional bowler. And when I go to the bowling alley, right, I rent my bowling ball and I bowl and I have a phenomenal time. And then I go home without a bowling ball. And so, not trying to minimize this, right? I know that was like a cute anecdote. Not trying to minimize this in any means, right? So I wasn't doing that, Scott, by any means. But it's just such a difficult conversation to have about background checks, for, against, all these sorts of things when, the conversation for me needs to be about human dignity. And my ability to be able to feel safe, right, when, Scott, I see you, right, as a white man, right, walking towards me with a holster and a gun in it. That scares me to death. Fundamentally, right? And there's more that we need to talk about that, right? The racial dynamics, right, that are involved in that. But I don't even want to have a conversation with you walking towards me with a gun. So I'm saying that to say, right, this conversation about it being deeper than, just the policies and the laws and really getting into the point is, how do we lift, right, human dignity to the apex of this conversation? Not have a conversation about what people can and cannot do, but have a conversation about people's right to life, right? More broadly. Can we settle the conversation in that versus settling the conversation in you're going to take my guns, right? Or you shouldn't have guns. That polarized conversation feels like it's getting us nowhere. But a deep conversation about our ability to reach towards human dignity, I feel like that's going to get us somewhere. And that's where I would like to be able to move this.
Great, Andrew, and then
Yeah.
Professor.
I just want to say, I agree with you that we need to have those conversations on that level, but I don't think one's exclusive of the other. I think they're both important. So I guess I take a little bit of issue when you say that this conversation doesn't matter, because I think it does.
Well, I never said that.
Well, yeah, you did.
No, I didn't say it doesn't matter. I said it's difficult.
It doesn't change anything.
No, I said it's difficult. I said it's difficult to have this conversation, right? Sort of floating above the head, right? And I say that with respect to the statements that that both of you have made, right? There are these, the loudest people talking, right? They're not talking about, let's just be clear. The loudest conversations that are being had are not conversations about human dignity. They're not. I mean, they're conversations about should you have a gun or should you not have a gun, plain and simple. And so what I'm saying is I would love these to be lifted in this conversation, a conversation about human dignity. And when I say it doesn't matter, I was being a bit hyperbolic. I don't think I said it doesn't matter. I said it doesn't necessarily change the things for people who look like me. Because on the whole, it just doesn't.
Yeah. And I think we are having those conversations. I think the Black Lives Matter movement and the Women's March and the rising up of people wanting to speak up, and there's a lot of hatred in this society too, but there's a lot of love and coming together for our immigrants and for our communities of color, and there's huge problems, but there's also a lot of awareness and wanting to speak up. I mean, and I've seen people marching, not just black people, but also white people, and everybody outraged. I have been too. And so I think that and it's a big problem, and it's one that's going to take a lot of work to solve, and we need to have those conversations, and we need to come together, and we need to do that work on that level. But we also need the 2.5 people in my little organization to work on the laws and push back on some of the bad things that are coming down the pike, because those laws that weaken public safety do matter. And although you don't think we should have the conversation, it's going on. I mean, that's what's happening down there. And so it's happening. So, starting where the conversation is where we need to go. And I think that it takes, I'm the only group doing what I'm doing in the state, and I think it's important. And I think we all have a role.
Well, just as a way of rephrase, right? Mm-hmm. So I think you took offense to it in a way that I didn't present it, right? So I never said it doesn't matter. I never said you shouldn't do it. I never said any of those things, right? What I said was it is difficult to have the conversation sort of floating above up here, dealing with, right, the lived realities, right? So it wasn't an indictment of your work by any means.
No, I'm sorry, but that is what you said.
So I'm gonna go to Professor Young at the other end of the table.
Okay, I want to touch on lived reality and human dignity at the same time here, in the context of how most people die by guns in the United States, except for those who commit suicide, by the way, which is, as she's already pointed out, the largest number by far. Homicides. There are two major misconceptions about homicide in the United States. If you ask people, and I've been doing this for a long time now, does it seem to you that the homicide rate, the murder rate in the United States has been going up, down, or basically remained the same over the last few years? The overwhelming majority of people say it's been going up. Well, let me tell you the reality. The homicide rate in the United States has been dropping steadily for the last 30 years or so. We are now at the lowest rate that we've seen since we've been keeping statistics practically, okay? But so that's the reality of how really dangerous it's not out there, okay? But it is a very dangerous world some places and for some people. How does a typical homicide occur? It's not like, and I'm sure you all probably understand this, it's not like what we see on TV and in movies and stuff. It's not a bad guy deciding to shoot a good guy, okay? It's not a person deciding, I'm gonna kill that person, so I'm gonna go get my gun and I'm gonna go do it. The overwhelming majority of homicides occur between two people who you can't know at the beginning of their interaction who's going to be the killer and who's going to be the victim. These are often character contests that get out of hand. One person says something the other person takes offense at, they retaliate verbally, that person feels that typically he, because overwhelming majority of these are people, are men, okay, sees that as a threat to his dignity, his manhood. So he escalates the situation. And eventually it escalates to the point where both parties, one or both, typically both parties, begin or immediately reach for whatever weapon might be available, whether it's a stick, a knife, a chair, or a gun. If people have guns available, there are going to be more killings because that's the way most of them occur. And it's about human dignity. The people who own guns believe that they need to be able to defend their dignity and their families and so forth, but they're basing this concern about the dangers that are out there that they have to respond to on the basis of faulty assumptions about what's really going on in the world. So this whole topic is fraught with tragic ironies, and one of the big ones, I think, is the misconception people have about why they need guns and what good it would do them to have a gun, and whether they would be glad or, very sorry that they did at some point in their lives.
Scott, can you couple things to bounce back your way. One, the question of safe storage and to what extent that's perceived as an unreasonable infringement, perhaps. And similarly, your position on a broader use of background checks.
Okay. Safe storage, I mean, I don't know anybody who believes that guns should not be safely stored. Where you start getting into the weeds is when you start talking about laws that require the safe storage of guns. In fact, one of the key points of the Heller case was a provision in DC's law that said, the law said you could not own a handgun in the city, and that's the part everybody focuses on, was the overturning of that handgun ban. But the other provision of it was it said that if you had a long gun in the city, it had to be disassembled and inoperable and stored separate from the ammunition, which basically meant there was no way you could use it for personal protection in the home if you needed to. There is a middle ground there. I mean, there are safe storage options that allow you to quickly access your firearms, and I'm a huge proponent of those. Anytime somebody starts talking to me about buying a handgun for the first time, especially since most of my friends have young kids, I start talking to them about their option. First thing I talk to them about is training, but the second thing I talk to them about is their storage options, because there are a lot of good storage options and there are some not good storage options. And if you do your research, you can find a way that allows you to store the gun in the home safely. And, this is something much like seat belts and smoking that 30, 40 years ago, people didn't think about that much. I mean, I can remember growing up in my house, my dad kept his guns on a high shelf in the closet, and the only instruction we got was if you ever try to look at those guns by yourself, you're going to be in more trouble than you've ever been in before, so if you want to see the guns, come talk to me and I'll let you see the guns. That worked in our house, but it doesn't work in every household, as the numbers will attest. And so, just like we've gotten smarter about, the way our kids ride in cars, we need to get smarter about the way we store our guns. I mean, I will tell you, I have 4 nieces and nephews, all under the age of 7, who live 1 block away, or 2 blocks away from me. And anytime they come over, the first thing my wife and I do is a quick check where are all the guns? Is there anything accessible in the house that they could get to? Sometimes it means, a gun that's been sitting out for some reason, we throw it in the safe. Sometimes it means we just lock the bedroom door, but we're aware of that. It's just, you have to be conscious of that. But I do think we start getting into trouble when we start trying to legislate these rules. I mean, there's laws in the book that say that if a child gets hold of your gun and harms himself or someone else, you can be criminally liable for that, and I understand that. But when you start saying you can't have your gun accessible in the home for personal protection, I think we start getting into a much, like I said, much murkier legal territory there. And at what point are you infringing on the Heller decision? At what point are you infringing not on any constitutional right, but just on that person's, individual right to be able to defend himself or herself in the home?
So let me push back on that a little bit, because you're the one who used the analogy of seatbelts. So seatbelts are required by law, correct?
Yes.
So what would be would you support some version of safe storage that's a safe storage version of the seatbelt that could be required by law?
I think, laws that create a penalty if you allow somebody to get hold of your guns, if you allow something bad to happen, that certainly creates an incentive for parents, for gun owners, not to let that happen. I don't know, this is one of those things, how do you even enforce this law until there's been an accident or something like that? I mean, it's very hard to, are we going to have police stopping by people's homes and checking to see if they're locking up their guns properly or not? I think this is, much better addressed through educational campaigns, teaching people the importance is. I mean, if you look at the number of child-related deaths from accidental shootings, it's relatively low compared to most of the other threats your children face. It's less than 200 a year. When you compare that to a lot of other risks, you realize this is not the most likely thing to kill your children. Now, that doesn't mean you don't address it. I mean, I carry a handgun, but I know that my chances of being the victim of a violent crime are statistically very rare. I'm not carrying it because I expect crime. One of the arguments I always hear people say is, well, why do you need to carry a gun in location A or location B? That's such a statistically safe place. I say, well, I don't go places that are statistically unsafe. I carry a gun in case crime finds me where I had no reason to expect it, such as in a Luby's cafeteria or in a college classroom. And so I think we don't want to start passing laws that are overly restrictive to address a problem that, at the size it's at, we can probably address it through education and more emphasis on civic responsibility.
Background checks.
I think there is a way to address the background check issue. One of the gun rights pioneers, I guess you could say, whom I really respect, is Alan Gottlieb. He's the founder of the Second Amendment Foundation. And he caught a lot of flack a year or two ago. He came out and said, gun rights community needs to get out ahead of the background check issue. Rather than letting the gun control community write these laws and maybe pass laws that have a lot of problems, we need to get out there and work with them and pass some laws that work for everybody. And I tend to agree, because when you look at a lot of the draft policies that have been bandied about, a lot of the pending legislation that we see each session to deal with this, you can tell their hearts are in the right places, but they have a lot of issues with them. One of the issues we see in a lot of these bills is record-keeping requirements on private citizens, basically saying that if you sell a gun, you're required for the rest of your life to keep records on this like you were a licensed gun dealer. Now, that's a pretty serious requirement to put on somebody. If I sold a gun and 30 years from now it gets used in a crime and they trace it back to me, I got to go through my paperwork and make sure I've got a record of who I sold it to. There's a concern among the gun rights community that if there's no way to transfer a gun without going through government channels, then you're creating a de facto registry. Now, whether that's a legitimate concern or not, certainly I think there are concerns with registries, because we have seen in many countries registries be used for confiscation. In fact, we've even seen it to a lesser degree in states like California, where something will be legal and then they'll decide it's not legal, and you're not grandfathered in, you don't have any way to keep it. So I can understand the concern over registries or even de facto registries, but I think there are ways to address this if we start thinking outside the box. For instance, if you have a Texas license to carry or concealed handgun license, when you go in to buy the gun, you're not required to wait while they do the background check on you, because that background check that was required to obtain that license is significantly more extensive than what they would do in the store. So they still submit your paperwork, they review it at the ATF, but you don't have to wait in the store when they do that. Now, what if that option were available to people other than licensed to carry holders, where you could go through a more extensive background check ahead of time, and then you maybe had it denoted on your driver's license, or you had a separate card that you could then show, like, hey, I'm verified here. So if you wanted to buy a gun at a gun show or something like this, you have this card you can show, and that they're at least making sure you've got the credentials, but you don't have necessarily the government apparatus that kicks into gear and keeps a record of that transaction. So like I said, I don't have it figured out, but I definitely think if we consider the concerns of the gun owners, and we look at some options that don't necessarily tie the background check to the gun, that you could probably come up with something that most gun owners in America would get behind.
So based on those answers, is it fair to posit that there's some relationship between the pro-gun community and a concern about the overreach of federal government?
Yes. I would definitely say that the pro-gun community and the minimal government crowd are the Venn diagram's almost a circle there.
Great.
So
yeah. Reverend Robinson, some of your most important work that so many of us are grateful for has been in economic justice and working for economic justice. You've spoken about looking at this issue through the lens of race and through the lens of human dignity. Can you look at it for us through the lens of economic justice?
Sure. So the reality that, right, there are, even if we're talking about, people's ability to own guns, buy guns, all these sorts of things, right? Most people who have guns illegally, right, are people who are poor. If they have, let me not say that, most people who have guns illegally are poor. Let me say this. Most poor people who have guns have guns illegally, right? Like, it's probably the better way to say it. Or that I know, that I've experienced, right? And it has something to do about protection. Protection from whom, right? And it's usually from protection from the people around you. How do I say this, Rabbi Stern? Truthfully. In a way that makes sense and is succinct. So I'm a preacher. I'm a Christian preacher, fortunately. So let me use an analogy. The best analogy I have is New Testament scripture where this is an issue that I have with Jesus. So a Samaritan woman comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, see about me. And Jesus says, I have not come to the dogs, I've come to the lost sheep of Israel, right? So I have a real issue with Jesus because Jesus just called this woman a dog. So I try to work through that theologically. But here's the reality, right? So Samaritans were seen as the outcasts, the oppressed of society. And so there's this whole conversation, right, about those people who are the outcasts or the oppressed of society, and economically we find ourselves as the dogs asking for the crumbs that fall from the master's table, because this is her response. Jesus said even the dogs can have the crumbs that fall from the master's table. So then you have black people, you have our Latino sisters and brothers, and you have all sorts of people who find themselves at the lower economic the lower economic strata, right, of society, who find themselves the dogs waiting for the crumbs that fall from the master's table. Well, if we're all the dogs fighting for the crumbs that fall from the master's table, then we end up fighting each other for crumbs. And we end up being pushed into these smaller pockets of society where we end up having to fight each other for crumbs. And then you insert guns into that situation. And so now we start killing each other for the crumbs that fall from the master's table. That is a situation that needs to be handled within our communities of color, within our most oppressed communities, and a situation that has been being handled for years, decades, by people of color and people in those communities. But the economic issue still persists, right, in these communities. And so there's high drug dealing, all these sorts of things, right, where people need guns to protect themselves. And so we have illegal guns, we have all these sorts of things that are in people's communities. Most recently, as I've been doing work, especially with blue-collar white people more broadly, same situation. People own guns and they own them illegally, guns that were passed down from dad or whomever. They don't have a license. They own these guns illegally, right? And the same issue, they still have economic struggle, right? They live in poor communities. And then you add methamphetamine. And then people are fighting each other. Again, the dogs fighting for the crumbs that fall from the master's table. But you add guns to that scenario, and no longer is it fighting, it's killing each other. So these are such broad and interconnected things. The only thing I can simply say is, simply put, with all of the issues that we are dealing with in our society, the deep economic issues that we are dealing with in our society, no one has made a valid argument that somehow adding a gun into that equation helps the situation. So I say a whole lot of convoluted things, but just the reality, you add a gun to the situation and the situation gets fundamentally worse. It's fundamentally worse. People growing up in the inner cities that are really just trying to get their kids to school and trying to help their community, they're not the people who own guns. They're not. Because they understand that adding guns into the equation fundamentally takes it to a bad place. My mother never let us have a gun, period. We couldn't have water guns, cap guns. We tried to sneak water guns in because I grew up in the super soaker generation. And when my mom would find, she would flip. Yet I still went to the military. I have a healthy respect for the destructive power of guns. A healthy respect for it, right? But understanding that fundamentally adding a gun to situations where people are already stressed,
living at the brink, their wits' end, just simply trying to make ends meet, we get a survival of the fittest situation immediately. And somebody ends up dead.
Professor Young, in the whole, not only in your work on the sociology of gun ownership, but in a variety of the other work, based on a variety of the other work you've done, I'm wondering if you have any reflection to offer on sort of the core philosophical question that undergirds this discussion, or, well, I shouldn't say that, it undergirds one part of this discussion, and that is this question of individual rights versus community responsibility. I wonder if that's played out in any specifics of the work you've done on gun ownership, and at what point, I mean, look, I think we're all smart enough to know that these aren't absolutes, right? You know, the very existence of stop signs proves that in the social compact we're willing to restrict our rights for the safety of the community, right? So every time I see a stop sign, I know that America supports some kind of accommodation between these two categories of rights. I'm wondering if you could reflect on that in terms of the specific issues before us tonight.
I wish I could. I don't really have much to say about that, frankly, because to me it's kind of a no-brainer. But obviously it's not a no-brainer to a lot of people.
What's the no-brainer to you?
The no-brainer is that, okay, we can allow people to have guns, but let's be reasonable about controlling the problem to the extent that we can. The idea that a person who, you know, background checks, we can pass laws, we can have legal requirements that people get screened and so forth, but those laws have to be obeyed by the people who are selling the guns, and there's ample evidence that many people have legally purchased guns who were, you know, mentally unstable, who had no business having them in the first place. And so I think that the work that you know, Andrea and Scott are doing is very important, because I think that, you know, if all gun owners were like Scott, I wouldn't be worried about it, frankly. But they're not. And, you know, the idea that it's one thing to own a pistol, it's another to own, you know, a semi-automatic weapon that can, you know, kill half of this, you know, room in a matter of minutes. We just have to be reasonable about it. And I think that we've shown ourselves as a society incapable of being reasonable about it.
Absolutely.
Because we allow politicians to make hay on the basis of irrational emotions that people have that are largely generated from things like economic inequality, like lack of opportunities to get the human dignity that you were talking about from work, and from having their work respected, and from being able to support their families. And until we deal with these larger economic issues, I think the best we can do is for people like Scott and Andrea to keep hammering away at the politicians, because ultimately they're the ones who make these decisions. I think, you know, the majority of the American people see lots of fairly simple solutions to some of the problems, but we just don't have politicians who have the strength of character and the will to actually do anything about these problems.
Except we elect the politicians, right?
To the extent that they can get reelected next time.
Right.
So,
all right, so word association.
I'm pessimistic.
I can tell. Word association, starting with Professor Young and coming this way. Okay, ready? The phrase association. The phrase is National Rifle Association. What comes to mind?
Very powerful, very effective, and very wrong-minded.
Okay, great. Andrea?
I almost said evil, but I'm too nervous.
You could say evil.
Evil. I'll say it.
There you go.
I'll say it.
Okay, good. Walls have not come down. Reverend?
The first word that came to mind was lobbyist. the next word that comes to my mind is obstructionist.
Obstructionist. Scott.
I would say frustrating, because the truth is the NRA has done a lot of good stuff for gun owners and for personal liberty in this country, and they have worked with me on issues before, and they were extremely helpful when they did. At the same time, they do some stuff that just leaves me shaking my head going, I mean, the inmates are running the asylum. What has happened to us? And so if we could get them to stay in the reasonable camp and not get sidetracked in some of these fringe issues, that they could be, if they could be more like they were 30 years ago, I think they would be a force for good in this country. The problem is they, along with the entire movement, have shifted so far to the right, and part of that's because in the last 30 years we've seen all these groups spring up to the right of the NRA who are poaching the NRA's, that fringe group I was telling you who provides most of the NRA's money. Well, there are groups now that they make their living from poaching those members, and the way they do it is say the NRA has abandoned you. The NRA is too ready to compromise. You need to leave the NRA and come give your money to us. And so what has the NRA done? They've chased the money.
Professor, gun ownership and domestic violence. Any of your research help us think about that?
I don't think there's anything there that would surprise anyone. I mean, like any other contentious situation, if there's a gun available, people are much more likely to die. Domestic violence is, in most cases, not unlike the typical homicide, in that you've got two people who both think they're right and neither think they're getting what they deserve from the other, especially in terms of perhaps respect or whatever. It's an escalation that usually starts from a small argument or disagreement about something. If there's a gun available, somebody's more likely to die. And of course, excuse me, men are more violent than women, let's face it. And men are much more likely to kill other men, and they're more likely to kill women than women are to kill either. Let me say this, and it's off target a little bit, but another thing I want to point out, just, again, a lot of people probably know this, but some may not. When we talk about race, we also need to keep in mind the fact that the majority of black people who are killed by black people. The majority of white people who are killed by white people. But it is also true that white people are more likely to kill black people than black people are to kill white people. And in large part, that's probably because the white people in everyday situations are more likely to be armed. So when we talk about inequity, there's an inequity there.
Andrea, Professor Young has described himself as pessimistic. You're working on this stuff every day. Something's getting you out of bed every day to work on it. Something has you not giving up. How can you make Professor Young feel better?
That's an unfair question.
I am optimistic. I said evil. I feel bad about that. I probably shouldn't have said evil. I hope there's no one from the press out there, and they're going to put that in.
If they are, they're evil.
Yeah,
so.
I know. No, I think we're getting stronger and stronger. The people that are speaking up against this are getting stronger and stronger. Moms Demand Action, our group. I mean, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. We're not going to change everything overnight, but starting to have a voice to counter the NRA and starting to have reasonable people come over and say, I disagree. Scott's pretty reasonable. And to have the courage to speak up, things will start to change eventually. I mean, last summer, Senator Murphy filibustered. I mean, when did we have that kind of strength on gun bills? Senator Murphy filibustered for, 14 hours to get a vote on background checks. John Lewis had a sit-in about gun bills after Orlando. I mean, it's terrible that it took in Orlando for this to happen, but things are happening. We, as a gun violence prevention group, had 6 good gun bills filed, and despite all the bad bills filed, you may not define them all as bad, Scott, but some of them I do. We've had a lot of good bills filed, and we're going to get hearings on them, and we're going to have the conversation, and we may even pass one. And that's the way it works at the Capitol. Sometimes it takes 3 sessions to get a bill passed, but progress is defined too as having the conversation and having a reasonable group that Republicans and Democrats can feel safe talking to. So I do feel optimistic that we're starting a better dialogue.
So Reverend Robinson comes from the world of community organizing. So Andrew, I would ask you, and in community organizing, picking something that's winnable is important. Andrea, what would you say do you see as your most sort of, again, recognizing that win could be described in various ways, what do you see as right now your most winnable initiative? What's the closest to achievement for you?
Getting a public education campaign on safe storage. I mean, even Scott admitted, education. No, we're not forcing anyone to lock up their guns. It's not a law about that. But the least we can do is tell more people. I mean, people say it's a no-brainer, but it's, why do we need click it or ticket? Because some people don't do it. And those campaigns have saved lives. I mean, 3,900, but we could have a lot more. When I say those numbers to the legislature, they're paying attention, and they're going, really? We don't have anything on this? So I think we can get some money from the license to carry. I think we can do a campaign about safe storage. It's a terrible budget year. We're in a budget shortfall, so not sure. That and the suicide prevention bill that we're working on. Because suicide is a big problem, and mental health is a big issue. Most people that commit suicide are mentally ill, and mental health is taken very seriously. There's a lot of attention on that at the Capitol. So,
Can you say a little more about the suicide prevention bill?
Yeah, so the bill we're working on, it basically just directs our state agencies to do some work on this, and to, even if they just put it on their internet. Do you know it took me 3 months to convince the Department of Public Safety that the word safety should be on their license to carry page? Literally, the word safety was not on there. I had to convince them to do that. But having our state agents say, yes, gun violence is a problem, and I'm going to put some information up there about access to lethal means. It also, in the license to carry class, that 1 million people, 1 million people are licensees, add a 5th segment on suicide risk, because when you have a gun in the home, you're at much higher risk of suicide. So for people to, and that's how we say, it's not all laws that is going to stop the tragedies. It's going to be awareness. It's going to be, when you have someone in the home that's at risk, lock it up, remove it from the home, recognize it. When your teen is a little depressed, hide the key to your gun safe. I mean, too many tragedies. Everybody's got a story. I'm sure there's so many stories in this audience. Doing this work, I hear so many terrible stories. So it does that. And the third thing is there's this interesting program called the Gun Shop Project that's in 20 states. And believe it or not, the suicide prevention folks ask gun dealers, sporting shooting ranges and gun shows to voluntarily just put a poster and a 1-800 number in their gun shop to help suicidal buyers. And 50% of those asked voluntarily said, I'm in. And it works. A suicidal buyer at a gun shop is quite different than another buyer. They want to do it quick. I've heard so many stories about someone that's bought it and in the parking lot has killed themselves. So it seems simple, but it wouldn't cost anything. It's voluntary. It's things we think people can get on board with and try to address the suicide issue in Texas.
Andrew, one follow-up for you. In the world of gun safety activists or gun violence prevention activists, what's worse, open carry or concealed carry? I know I'm not giving you a great choice there.
Yeah, I mean, probably open carry, but it's not, I mean, how many people have seen people open carrying? I mean, it's not, yeah, I mean, people don't, and we should ask you to Scott, do you do it openly or do you conceal?
Only time I've ever openly carried was on my way to the gun range.
Okay. Most gun owners can do it concealed because it's smarter. When I talk to gun owners, they say, well, why would I want my gun out? To show everybody to see it, someone to steal it, someone to use it against me. If I want to defend myself, I don't need people to see what I've got. So it's not, from what I understand, that it's not the smartest way to carry. It also causes some anxiety among people to see guns. I mean, we turn on the news and what do we see? We see shootings and some people like guns and some people don't. And that's their right, but I don't see any problem with carrying it under
Right,
so
so when
open carry is the worst.
And when we when we talk about, as many have said, when we talk about and this was reflected in a number of the cards here, when we talk about individual rights, there's also the right not to be terrified, right? Which is something that that is also a right.
Yeah, and I'll say just one last thing. It just makes it harder for law enforcement to know who's the good guy with a gun or the bad guy with a gun. Open carry just confuses people and doesn't make law enforcement's job any easier. So I think that's the problem.
All right, so I'm going to ask for closing thoughts. I'll give you each 2 minutes. We'll start at that end this time. Professor.
Okay. Well, I'm going to read you the last paragraph of an article I wrote a couple of years ago. Police in Fort Worth are investigating the circumstances under which a 72-year-old man armed with a handgun was fatally shot on his property by officers responding to a burglar alarm across the street. Police spokeswoman Tracy Knight said 2 officers encountered Jerry Waller at the back of his house near the garage early Tuesday morning and felt threatened. Waller's wife told WFAA that from what she could tell, her husband was shot 6 times. He had gone to see what was causing a ruckus outside the garage and carried a gun because he wasn't sure if someone was trying to break into a car in the driveway. Married 26 years, she says, and then somebody gets a little trigger happy and away they go, she told the station. As this case so clearly demonstrates, guns and the willingness to use them are not as much a product of feelings of vulnerability or fear of crime as they are of cultural scripts that call for aggressive responses in situations interpreted as threatening. Upon hearing a disturbance outside, rather than calling the police for further assistance and assessing the situation from the safety of his home, Mr. Waller grabbed his gun and moved toward the perceived threat. Although no criminals were present, the consequences of that move were tragic. And that happens over and over again.
This has been a really interesting conversation, and we have a huge problem in our country. 33,000 people dying due to gun violence every year, and it's going to take a lot to address it. It affects all areas of our society. Kids, older white males and suicide, communities of color, and we need the work that Reverend Robinson is doing. We need to look at economic disparity. We need to look at issues of race. We need to look at law enforcement and how they're doing their job. We need to look at our laws. And we need people like you to care about it and to speak up and do what you can, whether that's talking to others, whether that's calling your legislators, supporting work, coming down to Austin, or even making a donation to a small nonprofit like Texas Gun Sense. I urge you to get involved. Of course, it's going to take a lot of courage with our congressmen, with our legislators, and we'll keep working on it. But there's another one. Vote. Know who you're voting for. Know their records. Know how they vote on this. Thank you.
Reverend. So I'll close with a bit of a sort of a quote, paraphrase, if you will. So Martin Luther King Jr. was asked about the importance of changing policies and changing laws. And he said something to the effect of, it is the responsibility of faith communities, he said, clergy and religious leaders, and our education space to change the hearts and minds of our society. He said, but there is still a need for legislation. There is still a need for ordinances. There is still a need for policies. Because although the law can't make a man love me, it can stop him from lynching me. And I think that's just as good. I say that to say, as a clergy person, as an organizer, and just as a human being, I realize that we live in a broken society, and we live in a broken world. And yes, that's a problem. However, in the midst of that, I have the ability to dream into hope. And I have the ability to dream of a world and hope for a world where your desire to own a gun does not supersede my desire to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I fundamentally understand the desire to want to protect oneself and one's family. I fundamentally understand the desire to want to protect one's home and one's goods. But above all that, I believe that it is my responsibility as a human being in this society to always be willing to sacrifice my own safety for the safety of others. And yes, to some degree it is the person who has the gun and runs into the fight who is sacrificing their own safety for the safety of others. I fundamentally want to live in a world where that doesn't have to happen.
So one of the things that is frustrating about the debate over guns in America is that it's so oversimplified sometimes, in the sense that people want to boil it down to a debate over guns versus no guns, as if we're ever going to live in a society with no guns. I mean, you have to understand there's never been widespread gun control implemented in a country with anywhere near the number of guns that the United States has. So, in a sense, we're always going to be looking at compromise. Where is the compromise? And I do believe that 22 years ago, the state of Texas came up with a pretty good compromise. On one side, you had the gun control activists who thought that gun owners should be required to go through expanded background checks. They should have to undergo mandatory training. They should have to, go through a licensing process. On the other side, you had the gun owners who wanted to be able to have their guns with them for personal protection. So the state of Texas said, okay, if you go through an expanded background check, mandatory training, you obtain a license, you can have your gun with you for personal protection. That was a great compromise that has, by most accounts, worked out very well. Even most of the law enforcement officials who opposed it at the time have come out since then and said, we were wrong. The boogeymen we predicted never manifested. And so I think we need to be careful about moving away from that ideal of compromise. At the same time, I encourage those of you who maybe lean more towards the gun control side, don't be so quick to dismiss licensed concealed carry. Don't lump it over with the people who are carrying guns illegally or the people who are causing problems, because the most likely indicator of future crime is past performance. And when you obtain a concealed handgun license, one of the things you're demonstrating is that you have a very clean background. And so you're already demonstrating that you don't have a past performance record that would indicate you're likely to commit a crime. And that's why, for example, license to carry holders, concealed handgun license holders in this state are 1/9 as likely to be convicted of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon as is a person, as an adult who does not have a license to carry. And so I just encourage you, don't go looking for simple solutions to complex problems, because this is a complex problem, and while there are things we can do and there may be solutions down the road, it's not going to come in the form of one bill we passed or one new law that fixes this up for us. And one of the things I love about Andrea's group is that they are looking at all of the causes of gun violence. For example, she mentioned that there are about 33,000 gun deaths every year in this country. Well, about 22,000 of those are suicides. That is a huge problem, and one of the things that surprises people is that if you compare a state's rate of gun ownership and that state's degree of gun control with that state's homicide rate, there's no correlation. There's no correlation between the homicide rate and the rate of gun control. There's no correlation between the homicide rate and the rate of gun ownership. Where there is a correlation is between those factors and suicide. So owning a gun is a risk factor for suicide. Now, it's not the only risk factor. In fact, one of the highest rates of suicide is in Japan, where there's almost no civilian ownership of firearms. So many of the countries that have much lower gun violence rates than the U.S. actually have higher suicide rates, countries like Finland and France. So there's other factors. It's a cultural issue. But we need to take a holistic view to preventing gun violence. And the last thing I'll say is, in response to what the Reverend said here, years ago I was in a debate at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and they had me debating an anti-violence activist, just anti-violence, which my first comment was that's a little intimidating because it sounds like I'm the pro-violence activist. But one of his closing comments, which I loved, was he said, to solve a lot of these problems, we have to become a society where we look at our neighbor as a potential ally, not as a potential threat. And I think no matter what side of the debate you're on, that's what we need to strive for in this country, is look at the person to your left and to your right as potential allies. And that means, A, don't be ready to shoot them because, they may be the good guy, and also don't be afraid of the fact that they may be carrying a gun because they may be the good guy. We need to stop thinking of everyone around us as a potential threat, and I will leave it at that.
Thank you. Couple of closing thoughts. You put two preachers on a panel, and even if one's the moderator, I have to, see your quote and raise you one. So it is your home. I know. This is your home. That's why I only do so hospitably. I will. Core teaching in the Jewish tradition offered us by the rabbis in the Talmud 1,500 years ago, also echoed in the Christian and Muslim traditions as well as others. And this goes to Reverend Robinson's very first point about not getting so caught up in policies and statistics and numbers that we forget about the humanity and the human dignity that's at the core of this issue. That teaching of the rabbis is that one who destroys a single life, it is as if he has destroyed a whole world, and one who saves a single life, it is as if he has saved a whole world. So when we talk about comparative numbers and statistics and percentages, it's one person at a time, it's one child at a time, it's one story that each of us can tell, it's one funeral that a rabbi or a minister has done, and the numbers may pile up, but it's one and then another one and then another one. The second quotation with which I would leave you, and I think this may in some way sum up the really wonderful combination of difference and openness that we've heard tonight on an issue that is profoundly troubling to so many of us, is that of my teacher, Rabbi David Saperstein, who once said that the issue is not so much guns, but the idolatry of guns. And when we've heard about reasonable accommodation, we're still talking about guns, but hopefully we're not talking about the idolatry of guns. And so my teacher said that it's idolatry of guns that's the issue. And then he concluded by saying, and there is only one Jewish response to idolatry, and that is sustained moral outrage. And so I think that if we can take from this place a sense of listening, a sense of building the society where this conversation will be irrelevant, a sense of the reality of the challenge, and a sense of some hope at meeting it, then we will have spent our time well. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you all for being here. Thank you.